Book Theta. So Theta 1, we start off with the translator's note real quick. The subject of Book Theta is potentiality and actuality, which we have seen to be closely connected with the solution eventually given by Book Eta to the problem of unity. The first chapter of Theta gives a kind of overview of the subject. Potentiality and actuality can be considered in regard to process or change and in regard to substance. The first 5 chapters of Theta are devoted to the former aspect and the next 4 to the latter. Within the kinds of potentiality that are connected with change, Aristotle now makes a variety of distinctions. The most important of these is that between active and passive potentiality, the agent of change has an active potentiality to change the object of change, and the object has a passive potentiality to be changed by the agent. Both these potentialities are realized when the change takes place, and in a way they can be considered the same potentiality, but from the point of view of the agent and the object separately, they are, of course, distinct. The last section of the chapter deals with the subject of incapacity, the state in which some entity does not in fact have a potentiality which it would be natural for it to have. In discussing both potentiality and incapacity, Aristotle is in harmony with the account given in Delta 12, page 131. We have, then, covered the bearer of primary being. That item... Oh, sorry, that was the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. We have, then, covered the bearer of primary being, that item relative to which all the other categories of what is are focused. This item is substance. The accounts of the other bearers of being depend on the account of substance, those, that is, of quantity, quality, and the other items with similar accounts. For, as our earlier discussions have made clear, all these will turn out to contain the account of substance, but now accounts of that which are indeed distinguished as those of the what, quantity, or quality, but they are also distinguished as those of potentiality, and those of entelechy, and also by function. It is, then, time that we had a look at potentiality and entelechy. And let us look first at potentiality as per the primary account, for all that it is not the most useful for our immediate project, for it is not the case that potentiality and actuality are confined to those cases the account of which is in terms of process. With the account of primary potentiality behind us, however, we may deal with the other kinds of potentiality in the context of our treatment of actuality. We have elsewhere indicated that there is a plurality of account of potentiality and of having a capacity, but we can weed out all those kinds of potentiality, the account of which it is by homonymy. In some cases, for instance, the account depends on some similarity, as in geometry, and ascriptions of potentiality and non-potentiality are sometimes based on a thing's being or not being in a certain way. On the other hand, there are kinds of potentiality that are related to the same form, and these are all kinds of principle, their accounts relating to a single potentiality, which is a principle of change, neither A for something else or B for the thing that is in qua something else. There is, for example, the potentiality for being affected, which is a principle in the subject of change itself, or being changed by the action either of something else or by itself qua something else. And in contrast, there is a condition of immunity to deterioration and destruction at the hands of an external agent or of the bearer of the condition itself qua something else, through a principle of change. And in defining any potentiality of these kinds, we must bring in the account of primary potentiality. Another way of looking at it is that the account of potentialities is that the account of potentialities of the stripe is in terms either of their having or undergoing an effect of their doing either of these well. But this means that in accounts of the latter kind, those of the former kinds of potentiality are somehow present. An uncontentious point is that there is a way in which the potentiality for action and affection are a single potentiality. Something's potentiality may consist in its own capacity to be acted on, and in something else's having the capacity to be acted on by it. And B, a way in which they are different. They are different as follows. 1. The one potentiality resides in the thing affected, for it is affected through containing a certain principle, and through its matters containing a certain principle, such that different things are affected by different agents. For instance, an oily thing is inflammable, and a thing with such and such a proclivity to subside is compressible, and so on. 2. The other potentiality is in the agent. Examples are warmth and architecture. The one in the calorific agent, the other in the builder. Corollary. To the extent that something is a natural product, it is not affected by itself in any way. And this is because it is a single thing, and not one thing and another. As for non-potentiality and incapacity, this is the corresponding privation to this kind of potentiality. And so every potentiality is of the same thing under the same aspect as the corresponding non-potentiality. There are, though, a plurality of accounts of privation as follows. 1. That which does not have F. 2. That whose nature is to have F, if it does not in fact have F, either at all or at a time when it would be natural for it to have F, and either in a particular way, as, say, completely or to some extent or other. 3. In some cases, things constituted to have F and lacking it through force are said to be deprived. And we have another translator's note. Theta 2. In the second chapter, Aristotle introduces further refinements in the notion of a potentiality for change. He distinguishes between a rational and an irrational potentiality. Rational potentialities occur only in animate and rational beings, conspicuously in men, while irrational potentialities occur in animate and inanimate beings. The salient difference between them for Aristotle is that rational potentialities can produce either of their correlated pair of opposites, whereas irrational potentialities can only produce one. To take Aristotle's example, heating can produce only heat and not cold, whereas the rational potentiality of medicine can produce either health or disease. The arts and sciences in general are Aristotle's principal examples of rational potentialities. In the last section of the chapter, Aristotle distinguishes between a mere potentiality to act and a potentiality to act well. The latter is always accompanied by the former, of course, but the former can easily occur without the latter. For many purposes, it is the latter potentiality to act in which we are interested. That is the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. Now, there are principles of this kind in inanimate things and also others in the animates, in the soul, and especially in the rational element of the soul. So it is not a surprise that some of the potentialities too will be without, but others with, reason. Hence it is that all crafts and productive branches of science are potentialities, given that they are principles of change in something other than the bearer, or in the bearer qua something else. Now, potentialities with reason are in every case the same as the potentiality of the opposite, whereas with potentialities without reason, each potentiality is the potentiality of a single thing only. Thus, heat is a potentiality only for warming, whereas medicine is a potentiality for both sickness and health. The explanation of this is that a science involves an account, and the same account elucidates both the object and the privation of it, though not, of course, in the same way. There is thus a way in which it is the account of both object and privation, but also a way in which it is rather the account that of the object as a result. Sciences of this kind must treat of opposites, though they are of the one per se and of the other not per se. This is because the account is of the object per se, but of the privation in a way by accident, given that it is by negation and deletion that it elucidates the opposite. It is the opposite that is primary privation, which consists in the deletion of the correlate. However, opposites are not to be found in the same entity, and moreover, science is a potentiality of that which has reason, and since the soul also contains a principle of process, we have the result that whereas the salubrious produces only health, the calorific heat, and the frigorific cold, the scientist is a potentiality for opposites, given that an account is of both opposites of a pair, though not in the same way, and in a soul containing a principle or process, for the soul will initiate both processes from the same principle, applying them to the same object. Hence it is that things whose potentiality is conditioned by reason produce the opposite outcome from those whose potentiality is not so conditioned. There being a single principle, the reasoned account, which embraces them. What does not stand in need of defense is that a potentiality for mere action or affection is attendant on that for good action or affection, whereas the converse is not always the case. Patently, the man who does something well must also do it, whereas it is not, to be sure, necessary for the man who merely does something also to do it well. Another translator's note, Theta 3. Having now set out his conception of potentiality, Aristotle specifically defends it by attacking those who have most conspicuously rejected any distinction between potentiality and actuality. These are the school of Megara, whose position is that one is only potentially, say, building when one is actually building. Thus, potentiality and actuality always coincide and should be identified. Aristotle points out various absurd consequences which he holds to flow from any such identification. In the first place, it would mean that there could be no art or skill, possession of which just consists in having a potentiality which persists between its episodes of actualization. Secondly, no perceptible properties could exist except when perceived, and more generally, there could be no coming into being at all, and everything which did not exist would be impossible. This is a defense of the distinction by a reductio ad absurdum of its denial. In the last section of the chapter, Aristotle offers a kind of etymology of actuality, stressing its primary connection with action and process. This fits better with the account of potentiality and actuality stressed in the first 5 chapters of Theta than with that defended in the next 4. That is the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. Now, there is a chestnut that enjoys quite widespread popularity, not least in Megara, to the effect that X is capable of being or doing the F only when it is actually is or does the F. So the non-builder is no bearer of a potentiality for building. The only such bearer is the builder when engaged in his building, etc., etc. Exposing the idiocy of this buffoonery will not long detain us. An immediate and undeniable upshot is that if a man is not engaged in building, he is not even a builder. Assuming, as I take it, that to be a builder is to have a potentiality for building, and the case generalizes across the skills. But then we assume that it is impossible to have such skills without having learned and acquired them at some time, and that thereafter it is impossible not to have them unless one has at some stage disacquired them. And the options here are simple forgetting, physical or other impairment, or mere lapse of time. One option that is not available is the destruction of the object of the skill. It is eternal. So, the moment a man lays down his trowel, he will no longer have the skill, but of course, he may very well start building again at any moment. But when and how will he have acquired the skill to do so? The argument carries over by parity of reasoning to the inanimates. There will be nothing cold or hot or pleasant or perceptible at all unless something is currently observing it. So this Megarian wisdom turns out to boil down to rehashed Protagoras. And there is nothing will have perception either unless it is actually engaged in perception. But then, if we take something to be blind, if, though constituted to see, it does not, at times when it is natural for it to see, and in ways in which it is natural for it to see, in fact, have sight, the same individuals will go blind several times a day, and deaf to boot. And that is still not the end of it. I take it that anything deprived of its potentiality lacks capacity, but then anything not currently happening will lack the capacity to happen. And anyone who says that what lacks the capacity to happen either does or will exist will be a liar. It was just this that the lack of capacity prevented them from doing. So our brilliant Megarian friends will now have done away with all process and generation. The standing will remain on their feet, and the seated on those places where the Megarians keep their brains to eternity. After all, if anything is currently sitting, it is never going to arise, for it is not possible for anything that lacks the capacity to stand up to stand up. I take it that we have qualms about taking a stand or seat on this. I take it that it is apparent that potentiality is one thing and actuality is another thing. The problem with Megarianism is that it collapses potentiality and actuality, and this is a fairly serious scale chunk of common sense to be affronting. Okay, it is possible for something A to be capable of being something and yet B not be it, or indeed A A quotation mark. It has a mark on the top of the A. A to be capable of not being something and yet B to be it. And the point generalizes across the categories. It is possible that a potential walker it is possible that a potential walker not be walking and that a potential non-walker be ambulant. The thing which is capable of doing or being the F is the thing such that there is no impossibility of its engaging in the actuality of which it is said to be the potentiality. So, take sitting. If something has a capacity for sitting, and if everything is set up in a way conducive to its sitting, then there will be no impossibility in sittings actually coming about in that thing. The two, with being moved or moving, with standing or sitting, with being or becoming, or with not being and not becoming. Important note on terminology. The name actuality in our discussion, it is assimilated to entelechy. This constitutes a shift away from processes towards other things as well. For an actuality is thought most normally to be a process, and it is normal to hesitate before ascribing being in a process to things that do not have being, for all that certain other predicates are ascribed, such as that these non-entities are the objects of thought and desire. It is just being in a process that is not ascribed to them, and this is because actual being is a precondition of being in a process, whereas such actual being is just what these things lack. There are plenty of non-entities with potential being, only not being an entelechy they are not. We have another translator's note. Theta 4. Having rejected the identification of the potential with the actual, the error of the school of Megara, Aristotle now attacks the converse mistake, that of supposing that there is something which is possible which will never be realized in actuality. To admit such a thing would be to deny the existence of the impossible. The impossible is precisely that which will never be realized, and it is a mistake to hold that it is still, in some sense, possible. What this shows is that anything that is possible must at some time be realized. The notion of a potentiality that is never realized is a contradiction in terms for Aristotle. That is the end of the author's note. Back to the metaphysics. Now, if what we have stated either is the possible or something attendant on the possible, there can, of course, be no question of its being a true thing to say that X is capable of being, but will not be. But on these lines, we seem to miss out badly on things that are incapable of being. To see what I mean, take a man who says that the diagonal of a square is capable of being measured, but will not be measured. Such a person would lack a grasp of what it is to be incapable of being, on the grounds that there is nothing to prevent something that is capable of being or becoming from not being or being about to be. It is, after all, a necessary conclusion of our premises that there is nothing impossible in what is said, given that we might suppose that what is not but is capable of being either is or comes into being, and yet what is said is impossible, for it is impossible that the diagonal be measured. We must distinguish carefully between the false and the impossible. It is false that you are standing up at this moment, but it is not impossible. Alongside, we must take it as evident that if the being of B follows necessarily from that of A, then the possibility of B must follow from the possibility of A. For unless B be of necessity possible, what is to stop its being impossible for B to be possible? Suppose now that A is possible. We should not get an impossible result if, with A being impossible, A were supposed to be, but then B must needs to but then B must needs be. But B was supposed to be impossible. Okay, let B be impossible. But then if B is impossible, so must A be. But if the first of these two options is impossible, so must the second be. So then if A is possible, so will B be. If it really is the case that the being of B be necessarily entailed by that of A, and if, given this relation between A and B were not in this way to be possible, then the A-B relation will not be as supposed either. And if the necessity of B's being possible follows from A's being possible, then if A has being, so must B. After all, the necessity of the possibility of B, given the possibility of A, amounts to B's also necessarily being at the time, and in the manner if A is at the time at, and in the manner in which it was supposed to be possible. Another translator's note. Theta 5. Aristotle now distinguishes between natural and acquired potentialities. This distinction coincides with that between irrational and rational potentialities. The subject of Chapter 2, it is not possible to acquire an irrational potentiality, nor to have a rational potentiality inborn. The latter must be acquired by various kinds of training, habituation, and education. Aristotle also stresses in this chapter something that has been implicit in the earlier discussion, that a potentiality must have a determinate objective. A potentiality is a potentiality for a determinate action in determinate circumstances. He also adds the point that rational potentialities are different from irrational ones, in that they are not automatically triggered by the bringing together of the active and the passive potentiality. The possessor of a rational potentiality can decide not to use it even in circumstances in which it would be quite natural for him to do so. This is because rational choice is a condition for the development of a rational potentiality. Thus, the appropriate conditions are both necessary and sufficient for the triggering of an irrational potentiality, but only necessary for that of a rational one. That's the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. Potentialities as a whole we can divide into the inborn, such as the senses, the acquired by practice, such as that for flute playing, and the acquired by learning, such as that for skills. The last two of these groups are to be had on the basis of previous actualization. The potentialities, that is, are conditioned by habituation and the grasp of an account. But such previous actualization is not required for those potentialities which, not of this kind, are conditioned merely by the bearers undergoing a certain affection. Furthermore, the bearer of a potentiality has a potentiality for x at time t and in manner m. Here, insert all other qualifiers required by the definition. Also, some things are such that their process potential is conditioned by a rational account, and their potentialities are supported by reason, whereas other things, being themselves non-rational, have correspondingly non-rational potentialities. Given this, it is necessary that potentialities of the former kind reside in an inanimate bearer, whereas those of the latter kind are to be found in both animates and inanimates. There is also a further peculiarity of potentialities of the latter, non-rational kind, and it is this. Whenever the potential active and the potentially affected items are associated in conditions propitious to the potentiality, the former must of necessity act and the latter must of necessity be affected. This is by no means the case with potentialities of the former kind. The explanation of this is that non-rational potentialities are all such that there is a one-to-one correlation of potentiality and effect, whereas with the rational potentialities, each potentiality is correlated with a pair of effects. So if the potentiality was, in the rational cases, automatically triggered, it would yield simultaneous contrary effects, which is clearly not possible. And from this it follows that the triggering of such potentialities must be under the control of something else. And in saying this, I have in mind desire or rational preference. The arrangement is that selection of the two possible contrary effects is under the control of desire and takes place when the context is propitious to the potentiality and the agent is associated with the item affected by the potentiality. And a necessary consequence of this is that whenever a rational bearer of potentiality is in propitious circumstances moved by desire for the object of the potentiality, it acts on it. The object affected by the potentiality must, of course, be in the appropriate condition. Its not being so will preclude the action of the agent. Hence the superfluity here of a ceteris paribus clause. The possession of a potentiality just is the possession of a potentiality to act. And such a potentiality is not unconditional, but depends on the obtaining of propitious circumstances, which include the satisfaction of a ceteris paribus condition. The cetera, that is, are made pariah by the very contents of the definition. Hence, too, not even the possession of a wish or desire for two simultaneous or even contrary actions make their performance possessible. Such a performance is excluded by the intrinsic character of the potentiality. The potentiality is not a potentiality for doing both things at the same time, just because it is a potentiality for doing both things of which it is the potentiality. So we have another author's note here. Theta 6. Aristotle now passes to the subject of potentiality in relation to substance and being. He begins by illustrating the notion of actual being by such examples as a statue, which has been produced from wood rather than one that is still in the wood. A thing is actual when it has already become the thing that it is. Having previously merely had a potentiality to be it, this sense of actuality is closer to such modern notions as actualization, as opposed to activity or enactment, which suit better the actuality of process. Aristotle insists on the diversity of kinds of actuality and potentiality and illustrates these in some detail. A special case is that of the infinite and the void, which has being only in potentiality and not in actuality, and thus seems to be an exception to the rule stipulated in Chapter 3. The last part of the chapter draws an especially important distinction between incomplete and complete actions. The latter, but not the former, contain their purposes within themselves. To dance, for instance, is to engage in a complete action, whereas to fetch wood for a fire is to engage in an incomplete one. It is only the complete kind of action that constitutes the highest realization of the form of a being. That is the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. We have now covered that potentiality, the account of which is conditioned by process, it is time to move on to actuality. Here are two questions. 1. What is actuality? 2. What sort of thing is actuality? In fact, as we look into potentiality, a certain fact will become apparent. This is what we do not only give an account in terms of potentiality of things constituted to initiate processes in other things, or to have processes initiated in themselves by others, and this either simplicator or in some particular manner, there is also another way potentiality can be included in an account. And indeed, it is for the sake of bringing this to light that we have studied the former cases so closely. The fact is that the actuality of an object is its obtaining, and by this I do not have in mind its obtaining in that matter which we have accounted for in terms of potentiality. We have said that something exists in potentiality if it is like a statue of Hermes existing in a block of wood, or like a half line existing in a whole line. Given that the half line could be detached, we say too that a man is a scientist in this way, even when he is not engaged in theorizing, providing that he is capable of theorizing. In the case when he is, we say that he is a scientist in actuality. What we are getting at here will become clearly inductively on a case by case basis. It is not, in any event, right to seek a definition for everything. For some things, an overview is to be had by analogy. The point is that there is an analogous relation between the following pairs of items: the engaged builder, the apt to build, the waking or the sleeping, the engaged observer, the sighted animal with eyes closed, the thing carved from matter, or the matter and the processed, or the unprocessed. We then simply require that the former element of these pairs by the we then simply require that the former element of these pairs be the actuality by definition, and the latter the potentiality. However, not all accounts of being and actuality are similar. Rather, there is an analogy between them. For instance, A is in B or relative to C, X is in Y or relative to Z. Some cases of actuality stand as a process to a potentiality, others in the manner of the relation of a substance to a kind of matter. In addition, the account given of the being in potentiality and in actuality of the infinite, of the vacuum and of other such items is different from that of such being for many things that are, including such items as the thing seen, the thing walking, or the thing being seen. Ascriptions of potentiality and actuality to these latter items are on occasion straightforwardly veridical. Take the account of the seen item. The account is sometimes based on the fact that the item is currently being seen, and sometimes on the fact that it is capable of being seen. With the infinite, however, things are different. The infinite does not have being in potentiality in such a way that it will, at some time, have being in actuality and be separable. It is only cognitively separable. The absence of any end to division yields the result that the actuality of the infinite has being in potentiality, but not that it is separable. Now, none of those actions characterized by some limit is a goal. They are all to be reckoned among the goal-related items. Consider thinning. Not only is the attenuation itself of this kind, but also its objects, when being thinned, are undergoing just such a process, being not yet in that state which is the purpose of the process. A carry-on of this sort is not an action, at any rate not a complete action, inasmuch as the mere procedure in itself is not a goal. By contrast, the proceedings that contain their own goal are an action. Let us illustrate this contrast. When I am seeing, I also, and at the same time, have seen. When I am minded, I also, and at the same time, have been minded. When I am engaged in intuition, I also, and at the same time, have been so engaged. On the other hand, when I am learning, I am not also, and at the same time, in a state of having learned. When I am recovering my health, I am not also, and at the same time, in a state of having done so. Prosperity and having prospered are simultaneous, as are happiness and having been happy. Were this not so, it would be necessary for the relevant carrying on to cease at some point, as is the case with thinning. In fact, this is not the case. Rather, when one is living, in whatever manner, then one has already lived. Given this discrimination of procedures, one lot are to be labeled processes. The other activities, all processes are incomplete. For example, attenuation, learning, walking, and building, which are both processes and incomplete procedures. For it is not that at the same time one is walking and one has walked, is building and has built, is coming into being and has come into being, or is in process and has been in process. It is one thing that is initiating a process and another that has initiated one. By contrast, it is the same thing that has seen and that is seen, that has and that has had intuition. And our word for procedures of this latter kind is activity. For those of the former kind, process. These and similar considerations give, we think, a clear answer to our original questions, both 1 and 2. We have another translator's note, Theta 7. This chapter addresses 3 problems. The first is that of specifying the circumstances in which one thing is potentially another. Aristotle distinguishes his 2 familiar cases and says that in the case of the rational potentiality of an art, the potentiality is realized when it is both the case that the artist desires it and that there is no obstacle. Whereas in the case of irrational potentialities, all that is required is the second condition, that there should be no obstacle. He gives the example of earth, which is potentially a man, but only after it has first become semen, and then been deposited in a womb. The second point that Aristotle makes in the chapter is that if one thing is made out of another, then the latter is always, in a sense, a potentiality for the former. Thus, what is actual for one thing will be potential for another. And this continues down a hierarchy which leads ultimately to mere matter, which is not the actuality of anything but in a sense the potentiality for everything. It is a topic of traditional controversy whether Aristotle really accepts the existence of such matter. The last issue concerns the relation of potentiality and actuality to the substrate or subject of a thing. Aristotle distinguishes two cases where one thing is a subject for another: the case where a substance is subject for its accidents, and the case where matter is subject of a form. In the first case, it is the accidents, not the subject, that is potential, whereas in the second case, it is the subject, the matter, which is potential. Aristotle characteristically reinforces this point with an appeal to ordinary language. We do not use the nouns for the subject to describe the second case, which we do in the first case, but only adjectives derived from them. For instance, we say that a box is not wood, but wooden. And that's the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. A question that we must confront is when a particular item has potential existence, and when not. For it is not at just any time that it has it. Consider, is Earth potentially man? Well, no. Earth is potentially man at those times at which it has already become seed. Indeed, perhaps not even just at those times. Similarly, not just anything would be made healthy by medicine or by chance. There is, rather, something that is susceptible of being made healthy, and it is potentiality. And it is this that is potentially healthy. Sorry. Now, the definition of what comes into being in entelechy. Now, the definition of what comes into being in entelechy from being in potentiality through the operation of thinking is that it comes about whenever there is a wish for it, providing nothing extrinsic blocks it. Whereas the definition of that which comes into being in entelechy in here, what is made healthy is that it comes about just at those times at which there is nothing intrinsic to it to block this. In just the same way, a thing is potentially a house if A, there is nothing in its contents and in its matter to prevent it from being a house, and B, there is nothing that must be added to it, subtracted from it, or changed in it, and the point can be generalized for all things, the principle of whose production is external to them. And conversely, you take something the principle of whose production is intrinsic to it, such a thing is potentially all the things that it will be off its own bat. If nothing extrinsic prevents it, by this condition, seed is not potentially a man. For to become such, it needs to be in something else and to undergo a change. At such times, however, as it is already through the principle intrinsic to it of the appropriate kind, then is it already potentially a man. Before then, it requires the other principle, and this is just as it is with earth too. Earth is not, as it is, potentially a statue. To be potentially a statue, it must undergo a change and be bronze. Now, the accounts of some things are framed not in terms of some x, but in terms of being x esque. We do not, for instance, account for a box as being wood, but as being wood esque. In turn, the wood is not said to be earth, but to be earth esque. Perhaps, indeed, we can go on. Perhaps earth is to be said to be not some other x, but some other x esque. About such things, we can make a generalization. In all cases, such a thing is potentially the next item in the series simplicator. So, for instance, the box is neither earth esque nor earth, but rather wood esque. And this is because it is wood that is potentially a box, and it is that is the matter of a box. Wood simplicator is matter for box simplicator. And this bit of wood right here is the matter for this box right here. If, moreover, there is something primary accounting for which as x esque in terms of some other x is no longer available, then this item is primary matter. If, for instance, earth is air esque and earth is not fire but fire esque, then it is fire that is primary matter, and such matter is not a this something. It is in this respect that the subject of predication and the substrate differ. In being or not being a this something, the subject of affections is a man, say a conjunction of body and soul, and its affections are such things as musicality and pallor. Hence, indeed, the subject, when music arises in it, is not called music but musical, and a man is not called pallor but pallid, not walk or movement but walking or moving. This is the same point as with the ex esque. Now, in all such cases, the last item in the series is a substance. In other cases, however, in which what gets predicated is some form and a this something, the last item in the series is matter, and substance as matter. And, in the end, it is right and proper that accounts in terms of being ex esque are applied to matter and to affections. Since it is both such items that are indeterminate, time to wrap up the discussion of when and when not to ascribe potential being to an item. Another translator's note, Theta 8. In this chapter, Aristotle defends one of his most striking and characteristic theses, that of the priority of the actual over the potential. Aristotle most definitely holds that the chicken comes before the egg. It does so in three ways: in thought, in time, and in substance. The priority of the actual in thought consists in the fact that one cannot have a conception of a potentiality without already having a conception of the actuality, while the reverse is not the case. The priority in time of the actual refers to the species rather than the individual. At the level of the individual, the potential, the egg, must indeed precede the actual, the chicken, but this is a relatively trivial fact. It is much more important that the species chicken must temporally precede the egg. The substantial priority of the actual is defended in terms of the equation of actuality with form, and thus with the principle and cause of a thing's being, and that of potentiality with matter. There is also an argument that the actual, being imperishable, must have priority over the potential, which is perishable. On the basis of our... Oh wait, that's the end of the translator's note. Back to the metaphysics. On the basis of our elucidation of the variety of accounts of priority, there can be no question but that actuality is prior to potentiality. The application of this remark is not restricted to potentiality as defined, and whose account is that it is a principle of change either in some other thing or in itself qua other, but is extended, quite generally, to every principle of process or stasis. The point is that a nature is something of the same kind as a potentiality. It is a processing principle, though it operates not in something other than what has it, but in that very thing qua other. Okay, so the actuality is prior to any potentiality of this kind. It is prior in account and in substance, and both is in one way and is not in another way in time. We need not linger over showing that it is prior in account, the primary potential, indeed, just as what is potential by dint of admitting of actualization. Our account, for instance, of potential builder is possessing a potentiality to build. That of potential seer is possessing a potentiality to see. And that of potential visible is possessing a potentiality to be seen. The account generalizes across the other cases, from which it follows of necessity that the account of the actuality is prior to that of the potentiality, and that the knowledge of the former is prior to that of the latter. With temporal priority, the situation is as follows. A species member in actuality has temporal priority over a member of the same species in potentiality, provided that it is not numerically the same species member. The point is this: take a man already in being in actuality, or a crop, or a seer. Well, his matter, or the seed, or visual capacity have temporal priority. It is these things that are potentially man, or crop, or seer, but not yet so in actuality. But other things which do have being in actuality have temporal priority to these items. And it is from these other things that the items have been produced. In all cases, that which is in actuality is produced from that which is in potentiality by the agency of something that is in actuality. A man, say, coming from a man, and a musician being produced by agency of a musician. In all cases, there is some priority. In all cases, there is some primary initiator of the process, and this process initiator already is in actuality. The point has already been made in the discussion of substance that every output of a production is produced from something as something and by something, and that the latter is conspecific with it. A corollary of this is the general acceptance that if you have never built anything, you cannot be a builder. That you're never having picked up a guitar precludes your being a guitarist. It is, you see, by playing the guitar that, when no one is learning to play the guitar, one learns to play the guitar, and this generalizes for all skill acquisition. This circumstance is the source of a celebrated piece of sophistry. The challenge goes, will will it not then be the case that someone who lacks science X is doing the very thing which is the province of science X, on the assumption that the learner is not a possessor of a science? This, however, is a mistake. Whenever something is being produced, some part of it must always have been produced. Quite generally, whenever something is undergoing some process, some part of it must already have undergone the process. See our distinction of process. So, by parity of reasoning, the learner too must possess some part of the science he is learning. This argument too then shows that in this aspect as well, the actuality is prior to the potentiality in terms of both of production and of time. And here we get to the crunch. The actuality also has substantial priority. First reason, things posterior in production have formal and substantial priority. A man has formal or substantial priority over a boy, and a human being has formal or substantial priority over a sperm. And the reason for this is that the man or human being already has its form, whereas the boy or sperm does not. Second reason, every output of a production progresses towards a principle, towards an end. A principle is something for whose sake something else is, and an end is something for whose sake a production occurs. But the end is the actuality, and it is for the sake of this actuality end that the potentiality is brought in. It is not in order to possess sight that animals see, but in order to see that they possess sight. And similarly, we bring in architects to build and are endowed with a capacity for theory in order that they may engage in theory. It is not, by contrast, to be endowed with a capacity for theory that we engage in theory, not, that is, unless we are acquiring theory by practice, and here we are only engaging in theory in a kind of a way, or perhaps we do not need to engage in theory at all. Also, the point of matters being in potential is that it may progress to the form. Whenever, by contrast, it has actual being, then it is actually in the form. The same applies to other cases, especially those whose end is a process. Instructors, after all, think that they have demonstrated their end when they have displayed an actual up and running object of their instruction, and for these reasons, nature does the same. This has to be the case on pain of a return of Paulson's Hermes. You could not say whether the statue was in or out, and so would it be with knowledge of nature too. The fact is that a thing's active function is its end, and its actuality is its active function. Hence, indeed, the very name actuality has an account based on the active function, which is extended to the entelechy. Now, it is true that there is a difference among actualities. For some, the use of the actuality is the last stage. Seeing is the last stage in the actualization of sight. No other active function over and above it is derived from sight. For others, though there is some such product, the output of architecture is not just an active building, but also a house. Well, even so, the actuality, which is straightforwardly the end in the first type of case, is even in the latter kind of case, at any rate, more of an end than the potentiality. For the act of building resides in the object of building, and has both its becoming and its being simultaneously with the house. So, For all cases in which there is some other product over and above the mere employment of the potentiality, the actuality resides in what is made, with the act of building residing in the thing being built, and the act of weaving in the thing being woven, etc. Always the process residing in the thing being processed. And in cases in which there is no other function over and above the actuality resides in the subjects, seeing in the seer, theorizing in the theorizer, and life, and so also well-being, a certain quality of life in the soul. I think that all this makes it pretty clear that the substance and the form are actuality, and the argument also suffices to show that actuality has substantial priority over potentiality. And also, as we have said, one actuality always has temporal priority over another. Going back to that which always, and in a primary way, initiates process, there is, however, also a profounder aspect to the substantial priority of actuality. That is that A. Eternal things have substantial priority over perishables, and B. No eternal thing has potential being. And here's why. Every potentiality is simultaneously the potentiality of the negation of what it is the potentiality of it. It is indeed true that what could not pertain to something would not pertain to it in any circumstances, but that does not mean that it is not the case that anything that does have a potential for being might not be actualized. So something with a potentiality for being admits both of being and of not being, so that the same thing has a potentiality both for being and for not being. And conversely, what has a potentiality for not being admits of not being. But whatever admits of not being is perishable, either simplicator or under the aspect relative to which it is said to admit of not being, whether in terms of place, of quantity, or of quality. But this means that nothing that is perishable, simplicator, has being in potentiality, simplicator. It could, of course, have being in potentiality under some aspect, such as that of quality or that of place. So all such things have being in actuality, and similarly nothing which has being of necessity has being in potentiality. And these, after all, are the primary things, inasmuch as, if they did not have being, nothing would. Neither indeed does any process that may have eternal being have being in potentiality. And if there is any eternal mover, it is not in potentiality that it is in motion. It can, however, be moving in potentiality relative to its point of departure and point of destination. There is no reason to prevent matter pertaining to it relative to these. Hence it is that the sun, the stars, and the entirety of the heavens are eternally in actuality, and we can chuckle at the concern of the natural philosophers that they may one day come to a halt. Nor are they wearied in their task, for in their case movement has nothing to do, as with perishable things, with the potentiality of its negation, such that the continuity of movement would be laborious to them. Labor is an effect of substance as matter and potentiality, not of actuality. But imperishables are also imitated by things immersed in change, such as earth and fire. They too are always in actuality, having their movement per se and in themselves. By contrast, our earlier discussion has shown that the other potentialities are all potentialities for the negation. Anything with a potentiality to initiate process in some particular way also has the potentiality not to initiate it in just that way. Such potentialities being those accompanied by reason. On the other hand, the same potentialities not accompanied by reason will only be potentialities for the negation by their mere presence or absence. A final thought. If there are any such natures or substances such as the purely logical thinkers claim the forms to be, then there must be something that is very much more knowable than the form of knowledge, and something very much more fully moved than the form of movement. It is these entities that will be rather the actualities, for which the forms will be the mere potentialities. I think we have made the point. Actuality has priority not only over potentiality, but over every principle of process. And we have another author's note here. Translator's note, Theta 9. This chapter draws a connection between the doctrine of actuality and potentiality and good and evil on the one hand and mathematics on the other. With things that are good, the actuality is better than the potentiality. This is because the actuality rules out the actuality of the corresponding evil, whereas at the level of potential being, it is possible for both the good and evil to coexist. Evil itself is said by Aristotle to be posterior to the potentiality. This means that it does not have actual existence in itself, unlike the good, and is thus not one of the eternal and imperishable things. The priority of actuality over potentiality is also evident in mathematics, especially geometry. A geometric proof consists in actualizing in thought the geometric relations potentially present from the perspective of thought in the figure. That is the end of the translator's note. Back to metaphysics. Here's an argument to show that the serious in actuality is both better and more worthy of reference than the serious in potentiality. Anything that is accounted for in terms of its potentiality has also, and by the same token, a potentiality for opposites. Anything, for instance, which includes the potentiality for being healthy in its account, is also something that includes in it that for being ill. And this, at the same time, the potentialities, therefore, for the following are the same: being well or being ill, being at rest or being in motion, building or demolishing, and being built or being demolished. The potentiality, then, for opposites pertains simultaneously to the subject, but of course opposites cannot simultaneously pertain, and the respective actualities, such as being well and being ill, cannot both pertain at the same time. It follows that one of the actualities must be the good. But the possession of the potentiality is both opposites in the same way or neither, so the actuality is better. And it is no less necessary with evils that the end actuality is more evil than the potentiality. What merely has the potentiality for evil is just as much one opposite as the other. Evil, then, is reviewed by the argument not to be over and above matters of fact. This is because evil is naturally posterior to its potentiality, hence to the circumstance that there is among the primordial and eternal things nothing that is evil, or defective, or corrupt, for corruption is to be counted as an evil. It is in actuality, too, that geometrical constructions are found. Discoveries happen when divisions are made. If the divisions had already been made, the constructions would not have needed to be found. In fact, before discovery, the divisions pertain to the figures, but only in potentiality. Problem: why are the angles of a triangle equal to two right angles? Answer: the angles around a single point are equal to two right angles. But then, if the line parallel to the side had already been drawn, the proof would have been obvious at a glance. Problem: why, quite generally, is the angle in a semicircle a right angle? Answer: if three lines, two baselines, and a plumb line to the midpoint are equal, then ... The conclusion is again clear at a glance. If you know that premise clearly, then discovery takes place by the bringing of things that are in potentiality to actuality, and the cause consists in the fact that the thinking involved is the actuality. It follows that it is from the actuality that the potentiality is recognized, and it is for this reason that it is by constructing that we gain knowledge. The numerically single actuality is, of course, posterior in production. Another translator's note, Theta 10. This chapter appears to digress from the central theme of Theta and return to a topic covered in Epsilon, namely being as truth and non-being as falsity. Aristotle examines the way in which statements can be true or false, which corresponds with the way in which things can have being or non-being. It draws an important distinction between the being of and the truth about composite things, and the being of and the truth about simple things. Composite things are themselves of two kinds, their components being either necessarily or not necessarily combined in the way in which they are. In the case of things which are necessarily combined in the way they are, the same statement is always true or false. True if it combines the components in the way in which they are combined, and false if it combines them in some other way. With composite things which need not be combined as they are, however, the same statement can at different times be now true and now false. With non-composite simple things, there is no possibility of combination of components in thinking about them. They can merely be intuited and spoken. There is thus no possibility of miscombination, so that falsity about such things is not possible. This also means that such things cannot have non-being, so that they are pure actualities and imperishable. That is the end of Translator's Note. Back to Metaphysics. That which is and that which is not are accounted for both in terms of the categories and in terms of the potentiality or actuality of these items or of their opposites. And further, and most fundamentally, that which is the true, and that which is not is the false. And these latter apply to things by their being put together or apart, and that in such a way that to think that what is put apart is put apart, and that what is put together is to hold a truth, whereas to have one's beliefs disposed oppositely to the facts is to have fallen into error. Well, but when is that spoken of as true or as false on one hand, and when is it not? We must ponder the account to be given of this. It is not on account of our truly thinking that you are white that you are white. Rather, it is on account of your being white that we who assert as much are telling the truth. Now, some things are always put together and cannot be put apart, whereas others are always put apart and cannot be put together, and still others admit of both being put together and being put apart. Against this background, to be is to have been put together, and to be one and not to be is not to have been put together, but rather to be several. Now, in connection with things admitting of being either way, the same belief and the same account becomes on occasion both false and true, and it is possible for the holder of it at one time to hold a truth, and at another a falsehood. In connection, however, with things not admitting of being otherwise, the same belief does not become now true, now false. Rather, the same beliefs are always true and always false. But what about things not put together? What is being or not being, and truth and falsity for them? Such a thing is not composed, and thus such as to have being when it is put together, and not to have being when it is divided, after the fashions either of the white log or the incommensurability of the diagonal, nor will truth and falsity pertain to them in the same way as in the above cases. Well, truth is not the same for these things, and neither is being, and truth or falsity for such things are, in the case of truth, contact and assertion. Mere assertion is not the same as affirmation, and in the case of falsity, ignorance is non-contact. There is no possibility for such an item of being eluded as to what it is, save only incidentally. And just the same applies to non-composite substances, about which it is also impossible to be eluded. Moreover, all such items have being in actuality, not in potentiality, else would they get produced and destroyed, whereas, in fact, that which is itself is neither produced nor destroyed, there would have to be something for it to be produced out of. This shows that anything that is in such a way as to be a something and to have being in actuality is something about which it is not possible to be eluded. It is possible only neither to intuit them or not. And asking a what is it question about such a thing, one is in fact asking whether or not it is of a certain quality. As for being in the way of truth and not being in the way of falsity, for one of the two cases, truth is a putting together and falsity is a non-putting together. And for the other, if the thing has being, it has it in a certain way, and if it does not have being in a certain way, it does not have being at all. Truth, then, for these things is intuiting them, whereas falsity has no being in connection with them, nor illusion, but only non-acquaintance. Such non-acquaintance, however, is unlike, say, blindness. Blindness would be analogous here to a complete lack of the intuitive faculty. It need hardly be pointed out that with things that do not have changed, there is no illusion with respect to time, given the assumption of their unchangeability. If I do not opine that the triangle changes, I shall not believe that on occasion its I shall not believe that on occasion its angles are equal to two right angles, and on occasion not that I take it would be a change. What I can believe is that some such thing is something, and that some other such thing is not. I can, for instance, believe that no prime number is even, or that some are and some are not. But not even this can be the case with something single in number. There is no possibility here of thinking that one of such things is something and that another of them is not. The truth or falsity of the belief, rather, will be in terms of something that is always this way, not that. That is the end of book Theta. The next book is book Iota.